This is a 4-minute introduction to the audio-described version of Our Stories Matter. This is an Out on an Island and StoneCrabs theatre production that lasts 48 minutes and shines a light on a century of hidden and forgotten LGBTQ+ people and places. It presents many historical figures who were born, lived or were inspired by the island from an LGBTQ+ perspective. The film is introduced by 3 narrators on the Isle of Wight shoreline on a windy day. The first presenter is Jamie Irvine, a young woman in her early 20s with light brown skin and dark, curly, shoulder-length hair. She has gold-hooped earrings and nose and lip piercings. The second narrator, Sydney Cardew, is a tall white woman in her early 30s with long, reddish-brown hair, nose piercing, light makeup and dark-rimmed glasses. She wears blue denim dungarees over a colourful blue and pink knitted jumper with black DM boots. Narrator 3 is Gary Fairhall, a smartly dressed white man in his early 70s with very short white hair balding on top. He wears a long navy double-breasted coat with a woolen scarf and gloves. These 3 narrators, Jamie, Sydney and Gary, open and close the film and each present one of the key historical LGBTQ+ figures. Jamie presents the history of Joe Carstairs, the fastest woman on water, and is joined in this account by the presenter, Krisha Mansfield, a tall white woman in her late 40s with an open face and long dark hair which is greying at the front, tied up in a French twist. Krisha has an Australian accent and at times she takes on the role of some of the key figures including Joe Carstairs and Virginia Woolf. Sydney explores Algernon Swinburne's relationship with the island and plays several voices during the LGBTQ+ Heritage Trail, while Gary educates us about Oscar Wilde. Other presenters introduce us to other key figures. During these accounts, there are photographs or portraits of the people, places and buildings on which they report. Sometimes there are images of the objects, artefacts or newspaper articles we hear about. The presenters film at various buildings and locations on the Isle of Wight. There are beautiful landscapes, white cliffs, rolling green fields and countryside, nature reserves, a range of impressive stately homes and manor houses, seaside towns, beaches and local wildlife. StoneCrabs logo. Out on an Island logo. Our stories matter. The Isle of Wight shoreline, a huge expanse of sandy beach seen from above. The round Tower Folly standing at the edge of Ryde Beach with its battlements. The 3 presenters, Jamie, Sydney and Gary, walk towards us along the beach, the sea behind them, and stop. Jamie.
LGBTQ+ identities have existed as long as humans have, from drag queens in Shakespeare to lesbians and the suffragettes. Yet, men dressed as flamboyant women performing on stage, that's a drag queen. And the same suffragettes who fought for women's right to vote, they were strong and brave, and some of them were strong, brave and lesbian. All women should just be allies at this point. However, history books paint a different picture. They tend to barely mention, completely ignore, or even go as far as to deliberately erase LGBTQ+ people's existence and contributions.
The Out on an Island project aims to queer the Isle of Wight's history and heritage and to shine a light on a century of forgotten LGBTQ+ people and places. You may ask, how do you define a lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans person? Nowadays we can and do have a language in which to self-identify, but let's remember that homosexuality was criminalised for a long time in this country and many people led closeted lives.
Using personal testimonies and factual research, Out on an Island portrays a surprisingly rich and diverse testament to the island's history from an LGBTQ+ perspective.
We will now take you on a tour, highlighting key locations connected with historical LGBTQ figures who were born, lived, or even inspired by our island.
The fastest woman on water, Marion Barbara Joe Carstairs, a black and white photograph of a woman in masculine clothes, thick wool coat with upturned fur collar, cravat and beret holding a cigarette. Presenters Jamie and Krisha outside the Classic Boat Museum at the docks in East Cowes.
It was here in East Cowes at the Classic Boat Museum, tucked away in the corner of the town behind the Red Funnel Ferry Terminal and the GKN Aerospace Factory, that we came across an exhibition celebrating the life of Joe Carstairs.
East Cowes is in some ways the sister to Cowes, the most well-known town on the island due to the International Sailing Regatta.
This town was based for the enigmatic Joe, who was actually born Barbara Carstairs in Mayfair in 1900. And aged 16, she lied about her age so that she was allowed to drive Red Cross ambulances in France in the First World War. She was a war hero. Not only that, she was an oil heiress, and her love for women was only matched by her love of the water. She was practically rolling in it. That's money, women and water, not oil. Joe said,
I was never a little girl. I came out of the womb queer.
Panoramic view of East Cowes as the camera sweeps over the docks and brings us to the exterior of the Classic Boat Museum, a huge white warehouse-type building with a Union Jack painted across the whole of the front. The presenters walk together and enter the museum.
her lovers were said to include famous actresses and women just as accomplished as she was, like Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Tallulah Bankhead and Dolly Wilde. Jo, a brave and wealthy woman, is quite possibly the most well-known lesbian connected to the Isle of Wight.
A large old wooden trunk is opened to reveal several shiny cups and trophies.
She was an accomplished yachtswoman and won many competitions in her yacht Sonia. Jo had tattoos, smoked cigars and dressed in masculine suits from Savile Row. Thankfully for the LGBTQ+ community, she had bigger fish to fry than worry about social gender conformity. After a time when she was short of money, she quickly became wealthy again, inheriting from both her mother and her grandmother.
In 1925, Jo met renowned boat builder Samuel Saunders, and she used some of her inheritance to commission him to make her a 17-foot wooden 1.5-litre hydroplane. Jo wanted something fast and dangerous in which she could dominate the sky as much as she did the water. It was painted in black gloss with a single white stripe, and she named it Gwen, after variety star Gwen Farrar, Jo's lover. It capsized on a test run, so Jo reversed the letters of its name, calling it Newg. Jo won her first race in the craft on Southampton waters. Samuel Saunders offered Jo the services of his mechanic and chauffeur, Joe Harris, and the two became great friends, racing together and enjoying each other's company. Joe Harris worked for her for 5 years.
In 1924, Jo won every single race she entered. She won races in the UK and Cannes. She had the fastest time in the Duke of York's Trophy, first round. But Jo was always competing against men because no women's races actually existed in that time. If you ask me, that was a blessing in disguise.
The camera pans the sunny docks outside and brings us back to the presenter Jamie, inside the museum, kneeling beside a wooden rowboat holding a book, The Queen of Whale Quay.
Her girlfriends included her secretary, Ruth Baldwin. And in 1925, Ruth gave Jo a gift in which she named Lord Todd Wadley, a leather doll a foot long made by Steiff toy makers. Although Jo had no interest of having any children of her own, the doll became as precious a possession to her. He was dressed like Jo, in Savile Row suits and Italian leather shoes. She even had his name on a plaque alongside hers, outside of the front door of Jo and Ruth's house.
Krisha browses the museum's exhibition, glass cabinets of nautical artefacts and information boards.
Although Joe Carstairs was strong and independent and racing successfully in Britain and America, where she was often the only British contestant, she wasn't popular with the media and was viewed with suspicion.
By the late 1920s, the tide was beginning to turn against the likes of Jo Carstairs. Her vaunted pluck was beginning to be seen as a rebellion against nature. In the immediate aftermath of the war, masculine women were perceived, at worst, as a contemporary curiosity. But in 1928, the publication of Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness irrevocably sexualized them. The heroine of Radcliffe Hall's novel was, like Jo Carstairs, a well-to-do woman who dressed in men's clothing. Like Jo Carstairs, she had served as an ambulance driver in France. And, like Jo Carstairs, she had a female lover. The book was banned.
In 1934, Jo purchased an island in the Bahamas called Whale Cay. She devoted herself to the community and protected the island from intruders by brandishing a shotgun. Unfortunately, she passed away in 1993, but her story would not be forgotten after Kate Summerscale was working on the obituaries desk at the Daily Telegraph when she came across the life of Marion Barbara Carstairs. The result was her book, The Queen of Whale Cay, where you can read all about the life of the fastest woman on water.
Ferguson's Gang, Newtown Old Town Hall. A black and white photo from the 1920s shows 3 smiling women in flapper dresses and a 4th in tuxedo and mask. Each hold a banjo. The presenter, Charlotte Reynolds, a white woman in her 40s with a round face and wire-rimmed glasses. She wears a black bowler hat over long dark hair tied in a plait and black buttoned coat with a blue scarf and gloves. She stands by a small bridge, the muddy banks of the river and bare trees behind her.
Passionate about the historic and natural environment, a diverse group of unconventional young women formed Ferguson's Gang in 1927. Some of them were lesbian or bisexual.
A swan waddles out of the water onto the muddy bank. Views of the Isle of Wight countryside, green fields and bare trees. Charlotte spreads out her blue picnic blanket on the grass and sits with her wicker hamper and flask. A small old red brick building with red tiled roof in the distance behind her with an external stone staircase. The Old Town Hall in Newtown.
They all had a great sense of humour and loved fine food, having Fortnum and Mason deliver hampers for meetings and excursions. They made many generous donations to the National Trust, including buying and repairing the Old Town Hall here at Newtown in the northwest of the island. Using pseudonyms and disguises, gang members remained anonymous during their lifetimes. On one headline-grabbing occasion, they triggered a bomb scare when, dressed in capes and masks, they deposited a metal pineapple at a National Trust AGM, which in fact turned out to contain money. The gang's leader, known as Bill Stickers, was the only one to formally identify herself as Peggy Pollard. A letter was sent on her instructions to the Times after her death in 1996. It's only fairly recently that others' identities have been discovered. When is someone going to save the Old Town Hall at Newtown? Asked Peggy's mother at a dinner party. Peggy was intrigued, and the next day cycled the 8 miles here from Freshwater to inspect it. Newtown had been a significant port in medieval times, with an official building on this site since around the 13th century.
Charlotte stands and walks towards the Old Town Hall behind her, a 17th century building. She climbs the old stone steps at the rear, which is plain and crumbling, and stands in front of the large wooden panel door.
In 1699, the building had been substantially rebuilt with the addition of this brick upper part. It had further 18th century alterations too. By the 1930s, it was in a very poor condition, in what was by then a very tiny village. It had been known as a rotten borough for many years, having had rights to elect 2 members of Parliament, giving them great power, despite hardly any population living here to vote for them.
Photo of the front with 2 arched windows on the first floor, a portico and columns.
The dilapidated hall had captured Peggy's imagination, and in March 1933, she suggested it to Ferguson's Gang as their second building project.
Photos of Old Town Hall prior to repairs. The side has 4 huge arched windows.
The gang concluded that the building should have a use following its repair, and they agreed with the National Trust that the Youth Hostel Association could make use of it, which they did from 1935 up until the outbreak of war in 1939. The women slept upstairs, with the council chamber used as a common room, whilst the men slept downstairs, where remnants of the old kitchen and washrooms still survive today.
Images of the green-painted kitchen walls with a long wood dining table and high-back chairs, a fireplace and tiled floor. Charlotte reads a National Trust information sign and peers through a casement window at the side of the building. The ground floor has 4 small casement windows. Above each of these stands a large arched window on the upper floor.
Having taught herself Sanskrit at the age of 16, Peggy won a scholarship to the University of Cambridge in 1921. She became the first female student there to gain a double first in Oriental languages. After further studies at university in London, she wrote a book, which she was later awarded a PhD for. These were impressive achievements for a woman in the 1920s. Peggy had caused quite a stir during her time at Cambridge. Known for wearing masculine outfits and having bobbed hair, it was fashionable to blur gender boundaries at the time. She had a number of flirtations and 2 very brief affairs with women, and an art fraud scheme got her involved with a group of lesbians. She also had a number of gay male friends. Her masculine appearance attracted the attention of Arthur Elton, but it was Frank Pollard she eventually became engaged to. Pollard liked Peggy for being so unlike a woman. Despite her relationships with women and having an independent spirit, there was still an expectation that women of her class should marry. Much to Peggy's disappointment, the marriage was not consummated, and Pollard seemed to have little interest in sex, despite Peggy discovering no evidence of him being gay, nor having a mistress. Whilst they were living together in Cornwall, Peggy had a passionate affair with a woman named Pauline Tweedy. She also later had her first sexual experience with a man, but it didn't go well and wasn't repeated. Without the women of the Ferguson's gang, it's unlikely that Newtown Old Town Hall would still be standing today. Beyond the saving of this building, significant in the island's history, they made many important contributions to the growth of the National Trust, helping people to experience, enjoy and conserve the historic and natural environment of the UK.
Virginia Woolf, pioneering author. A photograph of the writer with a long, pale face, long nose and sad, drooping eyes, her dark hair tied loosely in a bun. A presenter, Harriet Jane, a white woman in her 20s with red lipstick and dark hair and a high ponytail, stands outside a large, impressive white villa with black sash windows.
Peggy Pollard's mother moved to the Isle of Wight in 1922, following the death of her husband, John Gladstone, which was the nephew of the former Prime Minister. She lived in Briery, in Freshwater, which was the home built for the artist G.F. Watts, at the suggestion of the poet Alfred Tennyson. The Briery was where the photographer Julia Margaret Cameron's family had stayed. Enamoured with the island, Cameron bought 2 cottages adjacent to Tennyson's, and later linked them with a Gothic tower to create Dimbola Lodge.
Harriet approaches the large double doors at the bottom of the Gothic tower and enters Dimbola Lodge. She stands in an elegant room with large sash windows, a high ceiling, dark wood floor and a tiled fireplace. Framed portraits of black and white photographs line the walls.
Cameron was one of many Victorian A-listers who chose to make the Isle of Wight their home. She enjoyed the visits of many illustrious creatives, including W.H. Auden and Virginia Woolf, her great niece. Dimbola Lodge became something of a creative hub. Virginia Woolf was a part of the Bloomsbury group of writers and artists, many of whom had liberal views towards sex, and there were various complex relationships within the group. Virginia wrote her most famous literary works in the 1920s. In 1923, she wrote her only play, Freshwater, a comedy in 3 parts. It was based here in Dimbola Lodge, here in the small West Wight town of Freshwater, where, by the way, Virginia's parents first met.
Harriet looks out of the large bay sash window. 3 silhouettes walk along the skyline at sunset. Harriet stands by one of the portraits on the wall.
The plot of Freshwater revolves around the attempts of the young actress Ellen Terry to escape her marriage. It is a satire on Victorian convention, which Virginia and the Bloomsbury group fought hard to escape from. Virginia struggled and often criticised the conventional expectations of young women in Victorian society.
Krisha as Virginia Woolf.
Society in those days was a perfectly complacent, perfectly competent, ruthless machine. A girl stood no chance against its fangs. No other desire, say to paint or to write, could be taken seriously.
Harriet climbs the dark wood staircase and stands on the landing.
Woolf delivered lectures on the need for both a literal and figurative space for women writers in a literary tradition dominated by men. It was published as A Room of One's Own. She also researched the life of her great-aunt, Julia Margaret Cameron, which she published in an essay and in an introduction to her 1926 edition of Cameron's photographs. Encouraged by Vita Sackville-West, Woolf focused on her novels, To the Lighthouse and Orlando. Orlando was a queer hero whose life spans across 3 centuries and changes gender partway through their journey, experiencing the world both as male and female. It was published in 1928, shortly after Sackville-West and Woolf had spent time travelling together in France. Virginia dedicated this imagined biography to Vita. Nigel Nicholson, Sackville-West's son, declared their love publicly.
The effect of Vita on Virginia is all contained in Orlando, the longest and most charming love letter in literature, in which she explores Vita, weaves her in and out of the centuries, tosses her from one sex to the other, plays with her, dresses her in furs, lace and emeralds, teases her, flirts with her, drops a veil of mist around her.
Virginia finally directed her play Freshwater, and it was performed at her sister's studio in London in 1935. It was a gay jest in every sense, and the cast was made up of mainly the Bloomsbury Group members. Underneath the comedic elements of the play, there is an exploration of generational change and artistic freedom. Both Woolf and Cameron fought against the class and gender dynamics of the Victorian society. There are links to Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, and to the feminist lectures she would later give at Cambridge. Today, Dimbola Lodge runs as a museum, showcasing the life and work of Julia Margaret Cameron.
Alfred Tennyson, Poet Laureate. A black and white photograph of the elderly poet with stern, hooded eyes, a large Roman nose, a long, white, wiry beard, sideburns, and a dark moustache. He wears a wide-brimmed black hat and a white shirt. Farringford House, a huge, beautifully restored stately home of yellow brick and arched windows with black painted frames. The ivy-clad house has a grand entrance with a portico and 4 stone columns surrounded by extensive manicured gardens.
Poet laureate Alfred Tennyson lived on the Isle of Wight for much of his later years. He rented Farringford House in 1853 and then bought it in 1856. He felt pestered by the tourists and so then moved to Sussex in 1869. But he retained the house and spent much of his winters here right up until his death in 1892. Tennyson was an apostle at Cambridge, which was where he met his beloved friend, Arthur Henry Hallam. They formed a close relationship together and travelled across the continent. Tennyson was experimenting with Arthurian themes with his poem, Lady of Shalott, when he learned about the tragic news that Hallam had died in Vienna. Hallam's death deeply affected Tennyson for the rest of his life. He wrote Mort d'Arthur in response to his death, and later, in memoriam, Arthur Henry Hallam. Tennyson named his eldest son after Hallam. It is important that we highlight here that diverse genders and sexualities have been present throughout history. Our past is so much more than the cis heteronormative narratives would have us believe. However, we must be cautious not to impose our modern ideas of identity and terminology. Queering as a tool of historical analysis does not mean to ascribe a specific label onto a historical figure. What queering means is to embrace historical figures in their entirety, including the parts that are not so clear-cut and not so easy to interpret from a modern standpoint.
Views of the Isle of Wight countryside on a sunny day, rolling hills, white chalk cliffs. A marble Celtic cross with a tapering stem on a stepped base, the Tennyson Monument. It stands atop the cliffs, surrounded by panoramic views of the Isle of Wight.
so we include Tennyson, because of his intimate affection and the language he used towards Arthur Henry Hallam, although we do not know how they themselves viewed their relationship. It is important that we recognise the historical circumstance, the society, and the culture of the time, and that we acknowledge their love for each other in whichever form it existed. Queering exists even in the small spaces, in the subtle implications, and it is our aim to draw them out of the shadows into the light.
Let love clasp grief, lest both be drowned. Let darkness keep her raven gloss. Ah, sweeter to be drunk with loss, to dance with death, to beat the ground, than that the victor hours should scorn the long result of love and boast. Behold the man that loved and lost, for all he was is overworn.
John Seely and Paul Paget, the partners. A black and white photograph shows two men working. One is sitting at a desk writing, his shirt sleeves rolled up, surrounded by papers. Another sits on the edge of the desk in his suit. They are both deep in concentration. A National Trust sign reads, Mottistone Estate, a large stone country manor house with several outbuildings and large grounds with herbaceous borders. Lisa Maria Seidenea, another presenter, walks towards us. She's in her 40s, has light brown skin, a wide smile and long black thick wavy hair. She is dressed casually in outdoor winter clothes, jeans and boots.
Images of Mottistone Manor show it to be the quintessential historic English country house. Developed over centuries, it is nestled in the Isle of Wight landscape, and its gardens offer a breathtaking spectacle. In my former life as a university lecturer, I used to spend interminable meetings imagining myself gardening in a sun-dappled Gertrude Jekyll garden attached to a stately home. And in 2016, I had the opportunity to make my dream a reality.
Lisa Maria enters her modern house, takes off her Wellington boots and sits on her leather sofa with a mug of tea.
My wife Anne got a job in Portsmouth and I found I could take early retirement. We didn't take the decision to move lightly. We'd both grown up in rural communities in Hampshire and Saxony-Anhalt, then East Germany, and we'd both escaped to the city for our education. Our sense of our queer selves was developed in the vibrant, diverse cultures of Sheffield, Manchester and Leipzig. We both knew that living in small communities could be restrictive. In fact, just as we'd made a commitment to buy our first home on the island, the local MP had to resign for allegedly making homophobic comments. Before we moved, we joined the first Pride March in Ryde, more from a sense of necessity than celebration.
I had not dreamt that I would discover queer predecessors while volunteering for the National Trust at Mottistone Manor. Yet it was here that I was introduced to the tantalising tale of Paul Paget and John Seely. It was their story that reminded me that non-normative people form the history, culture and fabric of our society, yet are often seen as the enemy, having to hide their relationships, desires and interests. The shack at Mottistone gave me my initial clue into the relationship of Seely and Paget, which started when they were studying in Cambridge in the 1920s and lasted until Seely's death in 1963. They designed the shack as their private living working quarters, where they spent a lot of time together. They were inseparable both in professional life and personal life. Paul Paget and John Seely were referred to by others and by each other as the partners.
An old stone church on a raised grassy bank surrounded by old gravestones. A plaque reads, Welcome to Mottistone Church. Enter through these gates, renewed in loving memory of our parents, John and Vivian Nicholson. They inspired us by their wisdom, faith, guidance and encouragement. May they rest in peace.
Paget's father was the Bishop of Chester, and Seely's father was General Jack Seely, 1st Lord Mottistone, both significant, well-connected establishment figures. Lord Mottistone gave the partners their first architectural commission, renovating Mottistone Manor House And from then on, the family's connections helped them to establish a thriving architectural practice, specialising in historic buildings such as Eltham Palace and religious architecture such as Lambeth Palace and Westminster Abbey. In 1963, John Seely died and was buried here in Mottistone Church. A statue of St Catherine was erected in the St Catherine Chapel Garden in Westminster Abbey as a memorial to him. The Latin inscription reads, John Mottistone. This is a sign of love and sadness. PEP 1966 ACD. PEP refers to Paul Paget. John Seely left the Mottistone estate to the National Trust, and it's because of him that I can volunteer and take pleasure in the beautiful gardens, manor and grounds of Mottistone Manor.
The war poet, Robert Nichols. A black and white photograph of the poet in profile wearing a velvet blazer over a woolen polo neck. His short, dark hair is smoothed away from his face. Waves crash against rocks. George Rennie, a young white man in his 20s with short, dark hair, is the presenter and walks amongst tall, thin pine trees in his long-belted navy mac.
It was here in Shanklin, on the southeast coast of the Isle of Wight, that Robert Nichols was born, 6th of September 1893. Not many folks know it, but Nichols was a prominent war poet. The Penguin Book of Homosexual Verse lists Nichols' poem, The Burial in Flanders, as one of the century's greatest gay poems to men who are wholly untroubled by gender.
My comrade, that you could rest your tired body on mine, that your head might be laid, fallen and heavy, against this my breast.
Nichols' birth happened in Eastmount. The building was leased by his paternal grandparents from Mary Nunn Harvey of the Cliff, Shanklin. Robert Melise Bowyer Nichols was baptised here at St Saviour on the Cliff on the 25th of November 1893.
An old stone church with huge nave and a tall tower with spire. Old black and white film footage shows men repeatedly loading and firing cannons hurriedly. Soldiers walk through debris. Other soldiers stand in a trench putting on their gas masks and helmets.
The outbreak of the First World War cut short Nichols' university career, and in October 1914 he became a second lieutenant in the Royal Field Artillery. Ill health meant that he could only serve in France between late June and early August 1916, after which time he was declared permanently unfit for general or home service and spent several months in hospital.
A war monument.
Nichols became one of the soldier poets of the First World War. His poetry collections, Invocation, and Ardours and Endurances were widely read and quoted. This established him as one of the more highly acclaimed younger poets of the day. Like his war poet friends, Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves, Nichols wrote graphic records of the battlefield. And while his poetry was inherently more idealistic, they all seem to have been vitally shaped and stimulated by knowledge of the gay milieu.
Other loves I have, men rough, but men who stir, more grief, more joy, than love of thee and thine.
In the diaries and correspondence kept by Nichols, Graves and Sassoon, we find the young men admitting to a vague sexual element in our war-harnessed relationship. They all seem to end up being torn emotionally by a succession of disappointing and often described as idealistic homosexual relationships. Sassoon, though, is the only one to be open about it in his diaries. We must remember that any evidence of homosexual acts on active service entailed a court-martial, and the consequences were even greater if the relationship was between an officer and a private soldier. In fact, during the Great War, 22 officers and 270 soldiers were court-martialed for engaging in homosexual activity. Deep and close bonds might therefore be safest if expressed in the romantic language of the love poem.
The presenter, George, strolls contentedly through the lush, mature gardens and sits on a bench.
There are records of Nichols declaiming his verses, followed by a piano interlude of ragtime tunes, played by Ivor Novello, whose homosexuality was an open secret in theatrical circles. Nichols later found his way into Hollywood, where he acted as advisor to Douglas Fairbanks Sr. in his filmmaking. Sadly, as a result of ongoing problems in both his financial and his emotional affairs, at the end of the 1930s, Nichols settled in France, just in time to see the German occupation, and in June 1940, he was on the last ship to carry British refugees from the Côte d'Azur. Like many of his contemporaries, Nichols was tied by the societal rules of the time and was unable to pursue his authentic self. He died in 1944.
Algernon Charles Swinburne, English poet. A black and white photograph of the poet in his 20s with thick curly hair and a side parting and full moustache. A later portrait reveals he has thick red shoulder-length hair and pale blue eyes. Images of East Dean, Charles Swinburne's former childhood home, show a huge Tudor Gothic house. The presenter, Sidney, dressed in red coat and colourful clothes and scarf, walks into the grounds of St Boniface Church, Bonchurch, a small rural churchyard.
Society demands that queer people appear quiet and respectable, to please the dominant society who tolerate us, to hide that which is seen as other, to conform. At times we draw contempt both from inside and outside the community. However, it is queer people who abandon the cloak of respectability who provoke change. Swinburne was an English poet, playwright and novelist whose connection with the Isle of Wight comes largely through his childhood, which was spent at East Dean in Bonchurch. In 1848, Swinburne was sent to live with the Reverend Foster Fenwick at Brook Rectory in West Wight, where he was to be prepared for Eton. Swinburne attended Eton from 1849 to 1853, winning prizes in French and Italian. It was while he was at Eton that he first began to write poetry. Algernon Charles Swinburne was not one to hide who he was, nor was he quiet about his beliefs. Oscar Wilde once called him a braggart.
Swinburne is a braggart in matters of vice, who had done everything he could to convince his fellow citizens of his homosexuality and his bestiality without being in the least bit a homosexual or a bestializer.
While it's true that Swinburne encouraged and even started rumours about himself, sometimes to draw attention and other times for humour, his sexuality was anything but. Biographers have speculated that it was Eton's tradition of corporal punishment that gave Swinburne his taste for sexual masochism later in life. He went on to attend Oxford University at Balliol College from 1856 to 1860, although he never received a degree. Swinburne cultivated a collection of literary friends, including Dante Gabriel Rossetti and William Bell Scott. The critic Robert Buchanan called Swinburne and Rossetti's poetry the fleshly school, owing to its sexually explicit content. Swinburne enjoyed his rather debauched reputation, going so far as to spread the rumour that he once had sexual relations with a chimpanzee, which he then ate. Swinburne lived for a time with Rossetti after the death of Rossetti's wife, Elizabeth Siddal, who was Swinburne's good friend. A commonly told tale at the time is that Rossetti once had to leave the studio where he was working in order to tell Swinburne to keep the noise down, and found him and a boyfriend sliding naked down the banisters. Swinburne's work was heavily inspired by his sexuality, not just his attraction to other men, but also his investment in kink. He was a sadomasochist, and this became incredibly relevant to his work. It was also why he was probably drawn to write on other taboo topics. He wrote extensively on the subjects of kink, sexuality, lesbianism, cannibalism, and death. He was particularly enamoured with the poet Sappho, and wrote work about and dedicated to her. Swinburne dealt with the taboo in all of his works, and throughout his life. He was an openly gay man at a time when that was a crime, and he received admonishment from it even from those who should have been sympathetic. In later years, Swinburne's social activities began to catch up with him. In 1879, due to his poor health and alcoholism, he was taken into the care of his friend Theodore Watt Dunton. He died in 1909 and is buried here in Bonchurch on the Isle of Wight.
Lord Louis Mountbatten, 1st Earl of Mountbatten, a white man in his 70s in naval uniform, double-breasted navy blazer with gold buttons decorated with many medals. He has a long face and a gentle smile. 2 young white male presenters stand outside a church. Tommy Venier has boyish looks with dark brown eyes and short curly brown hair. Andrew is pale and thin with bright red hair. Tommy.
Lord Louis Mountbatten's connection to the Isle of Wight comes by his appointment as Governor of the island in 1965, as well as his later appointment as Lord Lieutenant in 1974. However, his legacy on the island lasts to this day via the Mountbatten Hospice, named in his honour.
Mountbatten was born on the 25th of June 1900 to Lord Louis of Battenberg and Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine. His godparents include Queen Victoria and Nicholas II of Russia, and his nickname, Dickie, was given to him by the Queen herself.
In July 1922, Mountbatten married Edwina Ashley. Their marriage was not without its quirks, with Mountbatten admitting to his official biographer that
Edwina and I spent all our married lives getting into other people's beds.
He notably had a year-long affair with Yola Letelier, whose life influenced Collette's novel Gigi.
In 2019, Andrew Lowney's biography on Lord and Lady Mountbatten devoted a whole section to the question of Mountbatten's sexuality.
His research found that Mountbatten's bisexuality and his liaisons with men were well known throughout the whisper network of the armed forces.
He references many different authors and journalists, including Charlotte Breese's Hutch.
When he was Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, several officers boasted of their liaisons with him. A naval friend came across him on an island when he was serving in Malta, nude in flagrante with another officer.
Rumours about Lord Mountbatten's sexuality were in circulation both before and after his death. Buoyed by his friendships with Noel Coward and Tom Dryburgh, Lowney points to a private eye story published just after Mountbatten's assassination in 1979.
Residents living close to his London home at 2 Kinnerton Street, SW1, have hair-raising stories to tell of the rollicking all-male frolics held there by the ageing Matelot. Lord Louis, it seems, had a preference for young servicemen.
Lowney was able to correspond with a number of different sources. Upon the release of the FBI's files on Mountbatten, it was discovered that Mountbatten had a number of relationships with men. Some parts of the file still remain sealed.
Many people in power find it very difficult to be out. You could say the function of the closet is to maintain the status quo.
Coming out risks upsetting the balance of what is and what is not acceptable, what people do and what they don't know about you.
This balancing act may never end. Once you are out, people may still interpret everything you say and do through a host of stereotypes, both negative and positive, about what it means to be LGBTQ+.
In reflection of social change, royal attitudes to homosexuality has progressed since the 1960s. When Jeremy Fry, who was to be the best man at Lord Snowdon's wedding to Princess Margaret, was vetoed when they found out that he had a minor homosexual offence.
In recent years, more members of the royal family have taken steps to speak out on behalf of LGBTQ+ rights. The Duke of Cambridge became the first member of the royal family to be photographed for the cover of a gay magazine.
Appearing in Attitude, Prince William used this article to highlight the issues of homophobic, transphobic and biphobic bullying and its long-lasting effects on mental health.
Oscar Wilde, poet and playwright. A black and white photograph of a tall, flamboyant-looking gentleman dressed in a pale, double-breasted suit and a trilby at a jaunty angle over his thick, short, dark, curly hair. One hand is on his hip, the other holding an elegant walking cane. Gary is the narrator again. He walks outside Ryde Town Hall, a neoclassical pale stone building with porticos, pillars and a tall clock tower.
It was here in Ryde that Oscar Wilde came to give the second of his lectures on dress in 1884.
We may remember Oscar Wilde today, not only for his literary greatness, but also for his trial for gross indecency in 1895, after the details of his affair with the British aristocrat, Lord Alfred Douglas, were made public. Homosexuality was a criminal offence in England at this time. 10 years earlier, the island's newspapers reported that there was a large audience and an appreciative tone for the lectures on dress Wilde was delivering here at Ryde Town Hall. A week after the lecture, however, the island's newspapers reported contrasting reports in a style that is reminiscent of the British media today.
The Isle of Wight Observer noted that Mr. Wilde had the hearty concurrence of every sensible person present when he denounced the ugliness of the modern costume, and that Mr. Wilde was warmly applauded at the conclusion of his lecture, many of his remarks evidently being highly appreciated. Whilst on the same day, the Isle of Wight Advertiser and Newport Times ran the following short notice.
Mr. Oscar Wilde. On Friday, this gentleman delivered a very interesting lecture on dress at the town hall to a good audience.
Ryde Times, however, in an article entitled Lecture on Dress, went on to report,
Friday evening, Mr. Oscar Wilde, so well known as the originator of the aesthetic movement, gave a lecture in the town hall upon dress to a tolerably good audience.
And then it went on complaining and criticising the lecture. However, the Isle of Wight Observer finally laid matters to rest by noting that the audience had come to scoff and marvel at the spectacle that was Wilde. But in the end, they gave him a standing ovation and showed their appreciation.
The seaside town of Ryde, with Victorian buildings and shops on the high street, the sea stretching out in the distance.
The lecture itself has not survived, but the book, Oscar Wilde on Dress, includes The Philosophy of Dress, an essay that Wilde had published in the New York Tribune around this time, based on the lecture, and along with a few exchanges in the letters column of the local papers. During this time, Wilde also posed for a photo shoot at the studios of Jabbers, Hughes and Mullins, which used to be situated here at Regina House in Union Street.
A busy high street, dense with narrow shops and parked cars, slopes down towards the blue sea. The Folly Tower on the beach at Ryde. The tower is circular with battlements and a turret. The three narrators from the beginning, Jamie, Sydney and Gary, sit on the wall outside. Jamie.
As we come to the end of our film, you're probably asking yourself, why is it that we don't know much about our island's rich creative heritage that has been shaped by people part of the LGBTQ+ community?
Queer heritage is everywhere. What we today call lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans or queer histories are embedded in the buildings and landscapes all around us. It is important that we recognise and celebrate them.
Our stories do matter. They are a foundational base of our history, our culture and our health. And in order to evolve, we need to pass on these stories to future generations through stories both new and old.
Museums, archives and public history repositories increase intercultural understanding and create community. They are a way of accurately representing minorities as well as majority populations and can provide a space for dialogue in what can be complex and sensitive topics.
The three narrators walk along the beach. They descend the steps of the tower and sit together again on the beach wall.
We invite you to continue the conversation further on social media, in education, inside and outside of your social groups, and if you can, at home too. Share your story, share our stories, because no matter the gender, label or identification, our stories will always matter.
The camera soars above Ryde Beach. Cast: Jamie Irvine, narrator 1 and Joe Carstairs. Sydney Cardew, narrator 2, Algernon Swinburne and several voiceovers. Gary Fairhall, narrator 3, Oscar Wilde and various extracts. Krisha Mansfield, Joe Carstairs presenter and voice of Joe Carstairs, Virginia Woolf and Charlotte Breese. Harriet Jane, Virginia Woolf presenter and various voices. Charlotte Reynolds, presenter on Ferguson's Gang. Lisa Maria Seidenaer, Paget and Seely presenter. George Rennie, Robert Nichols presenter and voices. Tommy Venier and Andrew Butcher, presenters on Lord Louis Mountbatten. Outtakes that didn't make the cut.
49 to 1853. I told you.
Written by Melissa Gilmore, Margaret Montgomery, Charlotte Reynolds, Franko Figueiredo, Caroline Diamond and Jamie Irvine. With thanks to Alfie in the Air, Arts Council England, Dimbola Lodge, Carisbrooke Castle Museum. Thanks also to East Cowes Classic Boat Museum, Farringford Historic House, Quay Arts Centre, St Boniface Old Church, the National Trust, Museum of Island History and Shanklin Historic Society.
Getting distracted looking at the view because it's just so gorgeous. It's like I don't really want to turn around.
Music by M. Johnson, adapted by Prettier. Curated by Out on an Island. Produced by StoneCrabs Theatre. Artistic Director, Franko Figueiredo. Executive Director, Fabio Santos. Project Manager, Caroline Diamond. Project Assistants, Wendy Cooper and Bronwyn Hamilton Brown. Executive Director, Chantal Eyre. Created by Prettier Films with their logo. Out on an Island, StoneCrabs Theatre logo, supported by Heritage Fund. Audio described by Emily Pollitt for Vocalise.